Complexities about the laws of Sfiras HaOmer. So I had mentioned to you the rule that if you miss a whole day, you cannot make a bracha, mikanu lahaba. But if, on the other hand, you did not count at night, you count during the day without a bracha, but then you continue afterwards with a bracha. Right? That's kind of a very well-known halacha, but I want to go over the lumdus of it. The lumdus is actually very, very interesting because, after all, if I can't make a bracha when I count during the day, then why can I make a bracha when I'm mamshech at night? So here's the thing. There are two different and unrelated machlokas rishonim about the law of the Omer. Halacha number one is, if you skip a day, legamri, some rishonim say you can make a bracha, and some say you cannot make a bracha. Now the reason for that is, how do you interpret the rule of tamimos? The Torah says that the counting of the Omer is 7 complete weeks. So some Rishonim say that in order to be tamimos, you have to have an uninterrupted count. So if you skip a day, by definition, your count is not going to be complete. So according to those Rishonim, you wouldn't count at all. According to those Rishonim, you lost the mitzvah. It's one big mitzvah. The one big mitzvah of 49 days, you didn't do it, you didn't do it. It's like saying if you only had 3 tzitzis for your 4 corners, do 3. No, it's not a mitzvah at that point, it's even an aveira. So according to some Rishonim, you would actually not count at all. Other Rishonim say that tamimos does not mean it's one mitzvah, it's 49 separate mitzvahs that you should perform over 49 days. But if you don't do it for 49 days, then do it for 48 days. Which means the machlokas rishonim is, some rishonim say if you miss a day, you don't count at all. Other rishonim say if you miss a day, you can count with a bracha. Meaning, in the rishonim, it's not that you count without a bracha. Like, in other words, in the rishonim, there's a rule. Some Rishonim say you've lost the mitzvah, so you don't even count. Other Rishonim say you haven't lost the mitzvah and you count with the bracha. Now, as a general rule, when we have a machlokas, whether a mitzvah still applies or doesn't apply, what we say is, do the mitzvah misafek, but don't make a bracha because it might be a bracha in vain. Okay, but you understand that is a compromise between two opposite positions. Like the Rishonim who look at it as 49 separate mitzvahs, you would actually make a bracha. And like the Rishonim that say tamimos is it's one big mitzvah, you wouldn't even count. Since this is regarded as an unresolved machlokas rishonim, so the peshara, the compromise that we have, al pi halacha, is to count without a bracha. That's if you skip the day legamri. I'll talk about where the other thing comes in. Okay, so that's machlokas number one. Now, this issue of tamimos is not only relevant with respect to forgetting, although that's the most common scenario, but the Minchas Chinuch has a very interesting question. What about a ger, a non-Jew who converted to Judaism during the Omer period? It could certainly happen. A person becomes a Jew, 2 weeks after Pesach. Now, presumably he was not counting the Omer as a guy, and even if he did, it probably wouldn't count as anything. So the question is, if you look at tamimos as one big mitzvah of 49 days, he missed it. He was a guy. And since he missed it, he would not be chayav, but we would once again, because of our pshara, we would tell him to count without a bracha. So one who is Megayer in the middle of Sfira would count without a bracha. And you get the interesting question by a bar mitzvah, same thing, although the maskana will be different. If a kid became bar mitzvah during the period of the Omer, so this is a little different than the ger, because the ger probably was not counting the Omer before his conversion. The bar mitzvah boy was probably counting the Omer because of chinuch, But the Minchas Chinuch still says that maybe what he did as a katan did not count as counting. So the Minchas Chinuch is actually mitzadeh that he would not be allowed to make a bracha after his bar mitzvah. But the halacha is not like the Minchas Chinuch on that one. On that one, for sure, listen, a 13-year-old is not going to be worse than a 12-year-old. I mean, let's imagine he wasn't bar mitzvah during Sfira. Because of chinuch, we would tell him he could count with the bracha. So what are you going to tell me? Now that he's bar mitzvah, he can't do it with the bracha? How is it shayach that he'd be allowed to make a bracha as a 12-year-old, and he's now disabled as a 13? So Lemaisa, the maskana is not like the Minchas Chinuch Shaila. A katan shehigdil who was counting would be able to make a bracha. But again, it's analytically, it's connected to this inyan of tamimas. So this explains the first din. This explains the din. If I totally skip the day, I count without a bracha. Because why? That is a compromise among two opposite views. One view would say you would count with a bracha. One view would say you don't count. You lost it. And since we want to be machmir, so we're machmir to make you do the mitzvah, because maybe you're chayiv in the mitzvah, but we don't allow you to make a bracha, because if you're not chayiv in the mitzvah, it's a bracha levatala, right? This is a very common idea that in Sfeikas, where you're chayiv to do a mitzvah again, we do not make a bracha. Okay. Or you don't make the bracha, but you can hear it from the chazan or hear it from somebody else. That's actually the better thing to do. Now, there is a second machlokas rishonim that's not relevant to the first machlokes, and that is a svira valid if done in the daytime? Meaning, the Torah says you have a mitzvah to count every day. Again, whether it's one mitzvah, 49 mitzvahs, that's a separate thing, but there's a mitzvah to count every day. Does that mean you have to count in the beginning of the day, which is night, or any counting during the day would be a valid counting for that day? That's a separate machlokas. Now, like the opinion that says a svira bayom is a good svira, you would make a bracha when you count in the day. Like the opinion that says Sfira Bayom is not a good Sfira, you wouldn't count at all, because it's not a good Sfira. So once again, because this is an unresolved Machlokas Rishonim, when you count in the day, you count, because maybe a Sfira Bayom is a good Sfira, but you don't make a bracha, because maybe Sfira Bayom is not a good Sfira, and therefore it would be a bracha levatala. Okay, so now we've explained two things out of three things. We've explained why if you miss a day, legamre, you count the other days without a bracha. And we also explained why if you didn't count at night, you count in the day without a bracha. So the third thing we have to explain is, how come if I count in the day without a bracha, I am able to make a bracha for the other nights? So here we invoke a rule called Sfeik Sveika. Sfeik Sveika, it's a very, very complicated rule in its applications, but this is called the rule of double doubt, meaning to say that if there's a ground to be lenient, it says, well, maybe there's this ground for leniency, but even if you don't have that ground for leniency, you have another ground for leniency. Now, when you have a Sfeik Sveika, if you have a suffix, it's either this or that, you don't make a bracha misafek, because maybe it's a bracha levatala. But when you have a double doubt to be makel, you could even make a bracha. So now let's look at it. Let's assume I forgot to count last night, and I counted today without a bracha. So now, when it comes towards the night, I have a double doubt that will allow me to count. First of all, there are Rishonim that say even if you missed the whole day, you could count with the bracha. And even if you're going to be machmir and say, if you miss a whole day, you cannot count. But some Rishonim say counting during the day was a valid counting. So I have a double doubt that would allow me to make a bracha further on. So, to make a bracha during the day, I only have a single doubt, because some Rishonim say Sfira B'Yom is good, and some say Sfira B'Yom is not good. That's one suffix. So I can't make a bracha. But Legabe, continuing my counting with the bracha at night, I have a double doubt. Meaning, maybe even if I skipped a day, I could make a bracha. Even though if that would be my only doubt, I wouldn't make a bracha. But there is that sad. And if you're going to be machmir and say, if I skip a day, I can't make a bracha, but maybe I didn't skip a day because counting in the day is a valid counting. So memela legabe, future countings, you have what is called a sveik sveika, and even though a suffix bracha you don't make because it's a suffix bracha levatala, but when you have a sveik sveika, you could even make a bracha misafek, and that is the predicate for why you are allowed to continue making the bracha mikanol haba. So essentially, it's a combination of two different machlokas rishonim, which combine to create a sveik sveika. The first machlokas is, if you missed a day legamri, could you make a bracha? The second machlokas is counting during the day a valid sfira in which you haven't lost your tamimas. And that's another reason why you could make a bracha. So when you only have one suffix, the halacha is count without a bracha. When you have a double suffix, you can count with a bracha. So that's the lamdas of sveik sveika. Again, sveik sveika is actually a very, very interesting rule that has many, many, many applications in Kol HaTorah Kula, in Orach Chaim, in Even HaEzer, in Choshen Mishpat. It pops up in many, many, many areas. In fact, let me give you one example. It's totally not Nogei Ar Sugya, but it's actually just something I'm learning somewhere else, but it's kedai to mention. And this is from Maseches Ksuvas. It says that if a man marries a woman, and in the time of the Chazal, there was Ersin, right? He would give her a ring, and she would be his wife, and then 12 months later, he would consummate the marriage. So let's say he discovers that she was not a virgin. She was not a virgin at the time he consummates the marriage. So the question is, the Gemara. So Rabbi Eliezer says, if a man says she's not a virgin, he is not allowed to live with his wife because maybe she committed adultery during the 12 months of Ersin, and under those circumstances, she wouldn't be allowed to be with her husband. So the Gemara asks Akasha, that's not emes, because she has a double doubt here. First of all, maybe she lost her virginity before Ersin, in which case she was a single woman. And even if she lost her virginity after Ersin, maybe it was ones, like a rape, and not ratzon, and that's mutter, right? A man is allowed to stay with his wife if she was with somebody against her will. So you see, this is an example of sveik sveika, right? Why is it a double doubt? Because maybe it was pre-Ersin, in which case it wasn't adultery. And even if it was post-Ersin, maybe it was onus, and therefore it's going to be mutter. So even though there is a possibility that it was post-Ersin baratzain, and that would be a suffix yisur d'oraisa, but because of sveik sveika, we allow him to stay with her. So the Gemara then asks the kasha, so how do you understand Rabbi Eliezer's statements? So how could Rabbi Eliezer say the wife is prohibited? So the Gemara gives two answers. One answer is, he's a kohen. Now, let's think about this. If he's a kohen, you don't have a sveik sveika, because like this. It is true that even if he's a kohen, if she lost her virginity before Ersin, it would be mutter. A kohen does not have to marry a virgin. But if she lost her virginity after Ersin, even be onus, an Ashes Kohen is forbidden. This is a very difficult situation. God forbid a woman is raped. If she's married to a Kohen, there's big, big halakhic problems there. So by an Ashes Kohen, if the man says she's not a virgin, you only have one suffix. Did she lose her virginity before Ersin? Or did she lose her virginity after Ersin? That's one suffix. If it's one suffix, suffix d'oraisa l'chumra, and he has to divorce her. So Ashes Yisrael, he doesn't have to divorce his wife because it's sveik sveika. Ashes Kohen is only one suffix. That's one teretz the Gemara gives. And then the Gemara gives another teretz, the opposite, that she was an arusa. There's a very long erson. Erson is normally a year, but theoretically erson could be many years, because a father could betroth his daughter literally from birth. Now, the Gemara says the case is she was mekudeshes by her father when she was younger than the age of 3. Now, younger than the age of 3, one does not lose the virginity. If the hymen is torn, it regenerates. So consequently, when you see a ruptured basulim, you know she had the relationship after 3. So in the case of a woman that was niskadsha, younger than 3, and now she's 12 or whatever it would be, you also only have one suffix, even by a Yisrael. You know for sure she lost her virginity after Ersin, but the only shaila is, was it ones? Was it ratzon? That's one suffix. Suffix di'oraisa l'chumra. So you see what's going on, meaning by Pesach Basuach, meaning a husband claims his wife was not a virgin, so by a stam Eishes Yisrael, she will be muteres to be with him because of Sveik Sveika. But Eishes Kohen, there's only one suffix. Was it pre-Ersin or post-Ersin? Because onus and ratzon is not a suffix. By a woman that was an arusa less than 3, you only have one suffix. The other way, is it onus or ratzon? But you don't have a suffix. Was it pre-Ersin or post-Ersin? Because her pre-Ersin, she was younger than 3, and there would not be a ruptured basulim had, God forbid, somebody, had intercourse with her before the age of 3. Yeah.
So, are we understanding that Rabbi Eliezer disagrees on the facts of the case?
No. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer, when Rabbi Eliezer said, if a man says my wife is not a virgin, he must divorce her, he is only talking about a case of Eishes Kohen or a woman whose father married her off below the age of 3. Because if you don't have one of those two cases, there's going to be a principle called Sveik Sveika. Okay, so again, as I say, you will encounter Sveik Sveika in many, many, many areas. And one of the areas is by Sfiras HaOmer. And this is the halachic basis for if I miss the night and I count it in the day, I can resume my count with making a bracha. Yeah.
The case in Ksubas, would the girl taking a Shavua or Aiden change the status of Asir?
Well, Adam would for sure would change the status. That's absolutely sure. Now, whether that's a big machlok. That's a whole huge sugya in Kesuvos about what ne'amanis she has. Can she simply say, it was pre-Ersin or whatever it is? That's a machlokas Tanoim in the second parak of Kesuvos, and a massive, massive sugya. I hope one day you will learn Maseches Kesuvos, and Maseches Kesuvos goes by the name Shas Katan. It is called miniature Shas because so many inyonim of Shas, call them Shas sugyas, Chazaka, Rov, many, many big principles are in Maseches Kesuvos. So it's one of those Masechtas. For some reason, it's not part of the official Ohr Somayach cycle. That's a bit strange. Okay, there actually is an ancient historical reason, but okay. But the Kolal does, huh? The reason I was told, I really shouldn't. I shouldn't let you in on inside stuff. That because Ksubis is a sexually explicit Masechta, it was thought that Balei Tshuva who rightfully want to be merachik themselves from that part of their world, again, I'm overly honest, unfortunately, should not necessarily be involved in that. So instead we like to talk about wild oxen and donkeys and the like, because that way you're able to distance yourself from that world. And when a person gets stronger in their Yiddishkeit and they're no longer connected to that aspect of things, then we can hit them with Ksubas. That was the historical reason I was actually told why certain things we don't do. Now, I hear it. But on the other hand, someone asked Rav Elyashiv about teaching things in Chumash to children that are sometimes, relatively explicit. I mean, the Chumash, kind of open about everything. And the question is, I don't want my kids to be exposed to that. So Rav Elyashiv said, if it's Torah, it's not going to hurt. If it's Torah, it's only going to benefit. So in the context of Torah, we can learn about sexuality, we can learn about virginity, we can learn about all those things that might be sins in terms of when we divorce it from the Torah. But within the framework of Torah or Gemara or Chazal, generally speaking, it's good. So my own netiya would be to go with what Rav Elyashiv said, but still there was a mahalach the other way. So that's why Ksubas is learned by the Kollel, but not necessarily by the yeshiva as a whole. Okay, so now you know a little bit of the inside history of Ohr Somayach. Okay, yeah. All right, so that was one aspect of counting of the Omer. Now, again, I want to go backwards. Again, we're kind of between Svarim, so we're dealing with peripherally different aspects of Omer Shavuos. That's kind of what we're doing now. I want to go back a little bit. And you'll remember, of course, that the whole mitzvah started when we brought the Omer offering on the second day of Pesach. And indeed, that's why Tosos and Menachos tells us that today, when we don't have the korban of the Omer, the counting of the Omer is Drabanan. That's a goof of what Tosos says, precisely because we no longer have the korban ha'omer. Now, I think we talked about this before. The korban ha'omer, Bizman HaMikdash, served an extremely important function besides just being a korban. And that is, it permitted the new grain of Eretz Yisrael to be eaten. The grain of the new year could not be eaten. These are the 5 grains. Not fruit. This doesn't apply to fruit, vegetables, or buckwheat or rice, but the grains of that you make mazonos on. Wheat, barley, rye, spelt, oats, right? Those things. You cannot eat them. That's called chadash, until you bring the Omer. So this raises a very, very interesting issue about the very first Pesach that the Jewish people spent in Eretz Yisrael when they crossed the Yarden River. This is in the beginning of Sefer Yoshua. Remember what happened. Moshe Rabbeinu died the 7th of Adar, and the Jewish people mourned and cried for Moshe for 30 days. On the 7th day of Nisan, Hashem appeared to, it's the beginning of Sefer Yeshua, Hashem appeared to Yehoshua ben Nun and said, prepare the people, for in 3 days they will be crossing the Yarden River. Miraculously, it's going to split, etc. And then they will begin the conquest of Eretz Yisrael, Yericho, Ai, all and the like. So Moshe Rabbeinu died on the 7th of Adar. Hashem appeared to Yoshua on the 7th of Nisan. We crossed the Yarden. Remember, the Yarden split. We crossed the Yarden on the 10th of Nisan. Then it goes on and says there had to be mass circumcision. Because remember that all the people who left Mitzrayim had circumcised before the Korban Pesach, but all the people born in the Midbar did not have a bris milah for 40 years. So how could they bring the Korban Pesach in Eretz Yisrael? So it's in the book of Yeshua that they all had a bris milah, etc. And that was a great, great thing, that Klal Yisrael was now nichnas into the bris. And it mentions that year they brought the Korban Pesach. Not in Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim was not even conquered yet, but in Gilgal. Gilgal was the first stop after they crossed the Yarden. And that's where they had a temporary Mizbeach in Gilgal, and they brought the Korban Pesach in Gilgal. Right? All of this, again, is in the book of Yoshua. So the question is this. The question is that you're not allowed to eat the new grain of the year until you bring the Korban HaOmer on the second day of Pesach, which is the 16th of Nisan. Which means, what did they eat, right? They crossed on the 10th. So what did they eat, let's say, between the 10th of Nisan and the 16th of Nisan? So that's not so much of a problem. According to one opinion, Hashem allowed the mun, although mun normally only lasted the day, right? Mun never lasted for afterwards, but they say that Hashem allowed the mun to tide them over. So they had mun, or they could have vegetables, or they could have fruit, that wasn't the problem. But there is one big problem, and that is the Torah says that the night of Pesach, you have to eat matzah. Now, matzah cannot be from mun. You can't make matzah from mun. Matzah has to be from the 5 grains. So how could they have matzah from the 5 grains? They didn't bring grain with them in the midbar because the midbar they had mun. So they could only use the grain of Eretz Yisrael. But the grain of Eretz Yisrael was chadash. And they didn't have any old grain for which they had brought a korban omer, because this is the first korban omer. So how could they fulfill the mitzvah of matzah the first night of Pesach? A mitzvah d'oraisa. So you know what the Gemara in Kedushin says? The Gemara in Kedushin says they did not fulfill the mitzvah of matzah that year because the only matzah that was available was matzah that had an isser of chadash. And therefore they couldn't eat that matzah till the next day when they brought the korban ha'omer. So ein achinami, an amazing thing. The very first Pesach in Eretz Yisrael, see, you understand, every other year is not a problem. Every other year, even though I can't eat chadash till I bring the omer, but I have yashan, I have grain that was mutter from last year's omer that I kept, that was stored. So every other year, this is not a problem. But this was a problem in the first year, because the first year everything is chadash, and there was no korban omer that mattered. By the way, there's a big machlokas. Does chadash apply to the grain that was grown by non-Jewish farmers, similar to the Shemitah problem? And here you have a raya beferish that there is an isser chadash even on goyim's grain, because the grain that they would buy would be from the non-Jewish populations. Yeah.
And we can't say that they had grain from when they conquered Sichon and those territories?
That might be a possibility, but it's mashma that unless they were planning about Pesach ahead of time, that they were living on mun. So, so God gave them meat. That's a separate thing, but there's no implication that they were using grain. In fact, remember that they only brought one korban Pesach in the midbar, so presumably maybe that Pesach they might have had grain, but they didn't. They didn't keep the laws of korban Pesach for 40 years. Did you want to say anything?
What did they? Were they not zocha? Like, did they do something wrong? Like, surely Hashem could have just asked Masa to show up the way that Hashem showed up.
Well, miraculous. This goes back to. Miraculous matzah might not be yaitze. You might not be yaitze matzah by Hashem creating it derech nes. That's the. Yeah, I don't know. But it says that the Gemara in Kedushin says they didn't eat matzah. Now, yeah.
And can we not apply? I don't remember if it's Rambam or Ramban regarding the war that they're about to wage, whether they can use that chadash.
Yeah, you're talking about the halacha that soldiers in time of a milchemes mitzvah to conquer Eretz Yisrael might be permitted to eat non-kosher food, even non-kosher food. So the question is, if they're allowed to eat non-kosher food, then why couldn't they eat chadash? That's an interesting question. I have to think about that. There is another question the Yerushalmi asks, which I want to say over. Your question is an interesting thing, but let's see. The question the Yerushalmi asks is this. We have a general rule in halacha called aseh doche lo sasa, that when you have a positive commandment to fulfill, a positive commandment, and the only way you can fulfill the positive commandment is by transgressing a negative commandment, and there's no other way you can do the mitzvah, that's very important. If there's another way, then of course you avoid the sin. But if there's no other way, the rule is the positive overrules the negative. This is called aseh docha. A positive commandment pushes aside a negative commandment. The clearest example that we have is this is why you can do a bris on Shabbos. Circumcision is a malacha. You're causing bleeding. It's one of the 39 malachos. And yet, if it's the 8th day, the positive mitzvah of bris overrides the negative prohibitions of Shabbos. Now that's why it has to be an 8th day bris. Because if you're doing a late bris, let's say the baby wasn't well, so you're doing the bris 30 days. At that point, there's no need to violate Shabbos because doing a bris on day 30 or day 31 is the same mitzvah. So why would we allow you to do the bris on day 30 and desecrate Shabbos? Do it on day 31 and don't desecrate Shabbos. But when Shabbos is the 8th day, there is a special mitzvah of doing a bris on the 8th day, and there's no way I could do it other than desecrating Shabbos. So that's the rule called aseh docha lo sasa. Now, this is not a simple rule. It has a lot of complications. I mean, let's take, for example, let's assume the only way I could fulfill lulav and esrog is by stealing it. Right? So why can't I steal it because of aseh docha lo sasa? And the halacha is I can't. I cannot do it that way. It's a good kasha. There are many, many limitations on the rule, but there is such a rule called aseh docha lo sasa. What is the reason? What is the logic of aseh docha lo sasa? So the Ramban in Chumash, Parshas Yisro, says very beautifully, he says that positive commandments represent love of Hashem. Because when you love somebody, you do things for them. Negative commandments, no, I dare not touch this treif meat, they tend to emanate from fear or reverence. So lo sasas are expressive of yira. Aseh is expressive of ava. And since ava is a higher madrega than yira, although you need the foundation of yira, but ava is a higher madrega than yira, that is why aseh docha lo sasa. So that's the rule. So the Yerushalmi asks a very good kasha. Yeah, there's a negative commandment not to eat chadash until the omer is brought. And if you eat chadash, you transgress a negative commandment. Do not eat the chadash. Yeah. But there's a positive commandment of eating matzah. Now, if I could have grain that wasn't chadash, then of course I can't eat the chadash for the matzah because there's no need to violate the negative commandment. But if the only grain that's available is chadash, and if I don't eat chadash, I'm not going to do the mitzvah, why don't we apply the rule of aseh docha lo sasa, that the positive should override the negative? Isn't this really a classic example? There's no other way. All the grain here is chadash. I can't use man for matzah. It has to be the chameshes minei dagan. All of it is chadash. I got a mitzvah. Aseh docha lo sasa. So the Yerushalmi gives two terutzim. Actually, I have to say this. I said we're my halacha this way. I have to say I am not a baki in Yerushalmi. Tosfos in Kedushin brings the Yerushalmi. I actually wrote down that. I think the Yerushalmi says it. The Yerushalmi says that you have to, if you got it from a middleman, so to speak, you got to mention it. So Tosfos in Kedushin brings the Yerushalmi. And the Yerushalmi gives two answers. The first answer is very interesting. It's a rabbinic decree. So interesting. It's a rabbinic decree from the time of at least Yehoshua ben Nun that says, well, listen, let's assume we said aseh docha lo sasa. How much matzah would you be allowed to eat? Meaning there is an issur of chadash. The fulfillment of the mitzvah will override the prohibition. But once you fulfill the mitzvah, you would not be allowed to take an extra bite. Now the mitzvah of eating matzah is fulfilled with a kazayas. Now that itself is a question, what's your kazayas? But let's assume you knew what a kazayas was in those days. If you ate even a mashahu more than a kazayas, you would be doing the aveira without the mitzvah covering you. So the Rabbanan made a gezerah, we will not let you eat the first kazayas, which by rights you should be allowed to eat, because aseh docha lo sasa, but we will not let you eat the first kazayas, lest you come and eat a second kazayas, more than that, which is a rabbanan. So it's fascinating that you're telling me in the time of Yehoshua, they didn't eat matzah that first Pesach because of a rabbinic decree, don't eat the first kazayas, lest you eat the second kazayas. That's answer number one, a drabanan. And then answer number two, actually I reversed the answers, so that's answer number two. Answer number one, that the Yerushalmi says, without giving a reason, it creates a certain formulation that the only asay that can override a lo sasa is an asay that was given at Matan Torah or later. But since the mitzvah of matzah was given before Matan Torah, it was given in Mitzrayim, so it doesn't have the chashivas of being a product of Matan Torah. I mean, you might have argued fakert that it's more important. It was given even before Matan Torah, but it says no. A mitzvah that was given before Matan Torah does not have that koach to be docha. You'll ask me, Akasha, what about bris milah itself, where I said bris milah overrides Shabbos, even though bris milah was given before Matan Torah? So the answer to that is going to be, yes, it was first given before Matan Torah, but it was repeated after Matan Torah, Parshas Tazria. But then you'll ask back, well, the same thing is true for matzah. Yeah, the mitzvah of matzah was given to us in Mitzrayim, but it's repeated in the book of Devarim. So bris milah and matzah are exactly the same situation, in which it was originally given before and was repeated after. So the Yerushalmi is a shver Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi is saying in its first answer that the mitzvah of matzah cannot be daicha because it's kaidem matan Torah. Bris milah is daicha. So you have to say ultimately that bris milah has a unique chashivas. The Gemara uses the svar that because this is the covenant we have with God, so what a bris can do is more than a general mitzvah. Every mitzvah is important, but a bris is a kind of a super important mitzvah, and therefore you can't raise the problems you have with other mitzvahs on bris milah. Yeah.
In terms of the answer about not eating a kazayas so that you don't go overboard and eat more, does that have, so when they, if that were, still that could, okay, so I guess that will never apply then, so they said the answer is we wouldn't do that.
And therefore you can't eat it all. So that's the rabbinic decree.
Okay, so I was thinking
now,
if they made matzah that year, they wouldn't even have made it. Because
they wouldn't have made it.
Right.
Now one final point. The Gemara uses this gezer that the Yerushalmi uses for matzah, dating it apparently to Yeshua's time. The Gemara actually uses the same idea for yibum. It mentions the following idea, that let's say you have a woman that was divorced, and a Kohen married her bavera. It's still a valid marriage, but it's a sinful marriage. Okay. The Kohen then dies without children, and the Gerusha falls to his brother as a Yavama. So the Gemara actually says, min HaTorah, a Kohen is allowed to be miyabem, a Yavama, because Yibam is a positive commandment. Living with a divorced woman is a negative commandment. The Aseh will be Doche de lo Saseh. But since the mitzvah of Yibam is fulfilled with the first act of intercourse, he wouldn't be allowed to have a second act with her. He'd have to divorce her right away. So Chazal say, we don't allow Yibam. We make a gezerah to prohibit the first bia, lest he come to a second bia. So the Yerushalmi is making the same gezerah by matzah. We answer the first kazayas because of the second kazayas, just as the Talmud Bavli makes the drasha. We answer the drasha makes a gezerah. We answer the first bia of Yibam, lest you come to a second bia. Okay, we'll stop here.